Do you understand whose bar this is? The man behind the counter didn't blink, didn't soften. His voice had the kind of weight that came from decades of being the last word in a room, and Emily Carter, 25 years old, $63 in her pocket, and 3 weeks sleeping in the back seat of a car that barely started anymore, looked him dead in the eyes and said the only thing she had left to say. I understand I need a job, and I'm willing to work for it. The entire bar went silent. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it, because what happened next inside that bar changed everything. The hiring sign outside the Black Viper had been there so long that the sun had bleached the letters almost white. Emily noticed that first, not the motorcycles lined up along the curb, not the low rumble of classic rock bleeding through the walls, not the way every single person walking past that building kept their eyes pointed at the ground like the place might reach out and grab them if they looked too long. She noticed the sign and she thought, someone still needs a person badly enough to leave that up there. That thought was the only thing that kept her feet moving toward the door. She had been in Silver Creek for 11 days. She'd come because she heard there was work. Some cousin of a friend of a woman she used to share a break room with had mentioned the name of the town like it was a possibility, and when you're down to your last possibility, you drive toward it. She'd driven 4 hours with the gas light on and parked in the lot behind a dollar store and slept sitting upright because there wasn't enough room in the back seat between the 2 garbage bags she was using as luggage. Silver Creek wasn't what she'd hoped. It was a tired place, a town that had once had something going for it maybe, but had since settled into a slow, dry stillness. There was a diner on Main Street, a hardware store, a laundromat, a gas station, and a scattering of buildings that were either trying to hold on or already letting go. Emily had applied to every single one of them inside the first 48 hours. The diner said they weren't hiring, but didn't make eye contact when they said it. The hardware store said they'd call her back. They didn't. The laundromat had a sign that said help wanted, but when she went inside, the woman at the register looked at Emily's clothes clean, but worn ironed on the front seat of her car using a trick she'd learned from her mother, and said the position had already been filled. It hadn't been filled. Emily saw the sign still in the window when she walked past 2 days later. She applied at a gas station 20 minutes outside of town, drove there on fumes, got told the manager wasn't in, drove back, and spent the next hour trying not to calculate how much longer she could stretch what she had left. $63. She'd counted it that morning in the pale gray light before the sun came all the way up, sitting in the driver's seat with the bills laid out on the dashboard, like they might look like more that way. They didn't. She was sitting at the counter of the diner nursing a coffee she'd ordered, because you couldn't just sit somewhere for free, and even at $2.50 it felt like a splurge, when the waitress behind the counter, a woman in her late 40s named Sandra with tired eyes and a voice that had spent years softening, bad news, nodded toward the window. You looking for work? Sandra asked. Been looking since I got here, Emily said. Sandra refilled her cup without being asked. That small thing, that quiet, unrequested kindness, almost undid Emily, but it's right there at the counter. She pressed her fingers around the warm mug and held on. There's a place hiring, Sandra said. She said it slowly, like she was handing something over that she wasn't entirely sure she should hand over. The Black Viper down on the end of Route 9. They've been looking for a bartender for months. Emily had heard the name. You couldn't be in Silver Creek for 11 days and not hear it. The Black Viper wasn't just a bar. It was a kind of legend. The town told itself a story. It used to explain the specific shape of its fear. Everyone knew someone who'd had a bad experience, or heard of one, or half remembered one from years ago that might have been something else entirely, but had since become part of the mythology. That's the Hells Angels place, Emily said. It is. 3 people applied and quit inside a week. That's what I heard. Sandra looked at her for a moment, not with pity exactly, more like the careful honesty of someone who respects you enough to tell you the hard version. You heard right. 2 of them quit before they even finished their first shift. Third one lasted 4 days and left without collecting her last check. She paused. I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying go with your eyes open. Emily looked down at her coffee. $63. A car that might not start tomorrow. 0 callbacks. She looked back up. What's the worst they could do? Sandra didn't answer that. Instead, she said quietly, That place isn't just a job, Han. It's a choice you can't undo. Emily left a 5 on the counter, more than the coffee cost less than she could afford, and walked out the door. Glad. She didn't go straight to the Black Viper. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, first hands on the steering wheel, engine off. She thought about the 11 jobs she'd applied for. She thought about the apartment she'd lost in March when the management company sold the building and tripled the rent in 60 days. She thought about the job she'd had before that, office admin, nothing glamorous, but steady, that had dissolved when the company restructured and eliminated her entire department in a single Friday afternoon meeting. She thought about the 6 months after that, surviving on temp work and savings, and then the 4 months after that, when the savings ran out and the temp work dried up and the choices started narrowing fast. She thought about her mother, who had died 2 years ago and who had raised Emily alone, working 2 jobs for most of Emily's childhood, never once letting Emily see her scared. Her mother had this saying she used when things got hard, delivered without drama, just flat and true. You do what you have to do, and then you do what comes next. Emily started the car. She drove to Route 9. She parked in front of the Black Viper at 2:15 in the afternoon, and she sat for 1 more minute, and then she got out. The bar was quieter than she'd expected. She'd imagined noise, chaos, something that would announce itself as dangerous from the outside. Instead, there was just the parking lot with its row of motorcycles, beautiful machines, if she was being honest, gleaming chrome and custom paint, and the building itself, which was solid and plain, the kind of place that had been built to last and had been lasting for a long time. She pushed the door open, and the room changed. It happened in a single breath. The low hum of conversation, the background music, the sound of glasses, all of it stopped, or seemed to, in the way that a room doesn't actually go silent, but your awareness of it sharpens so precisely that silence is what you remember. Heads turned, not dramatically, not with hostility, just she was noticed. She was assessed. Every man in that room ran the same calculation in less than a second. Who is she and why is she here? She counted at least 20 people in her first scan of the room. Leather everywhere vests, mostly the kind with patches that meant something specific to the people who wore them. Big men, most of them not young, carrying the particular physicality of people who had spent decades in their bodies without apology. Tattoos on arms and necks and hands. A few of them were playing pool. A couple at the bar. One man alone at a corner table who looked up from whatever he was reading and looked at her with brown eyes that didn't give anything away. Behind the bar stood the man she would later understand was Victor Hayes. He was 60 years old, and he looked like someone had carved him out of something that didn't wear down. Big shoulders, a gray beard trimmed close, a face that had lines in it, not from softness, but from weather and time, and having seen enough that nothing surprised him anymore. He wore his vest over a black shirt, and he stood with the stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that he didn't need to perform authority because authority was just something he had. He watched Emily walk to the bar. He didn't say anything until she was standing in front of him. Then he looked at the folder she was holding, her resume printed at the library 2 days ago, the only copy she had, and he said, "You looking for the bartending position?" It wasn't a question. He could see the folder. He could read a situation. "I am," Emily said. He took the folder from her, opened it, read it with the same unhurried focus he probably applied to everything. She watched his eyes move down the page. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. She'd expected her hands to shake, had been braced for it, but they weren't shaking. She didn't know yet if that was courage or just a particular kind of numbness that comes when you have been scared for long enough that fear starts to feel like ordinary weather. Victor looked up from the resume. "Do you understand whose bar this is?" The room was still listening. She could feel it without looking, the particular quality of attention that a room develops when it's paying closer attention than it wants to appear to be paying. Emily looked at him. Not defiantly, not aggressively, just directly. The way her mother had always told her to look at things that scared her because looking away never made anything smaller. "I understand I need a job, Bob," she said, "and I'm willing to work for it." Victor Hayes held her gaze for 5 full seconds. She counted them. Then something shifted, barely perceptible, in the corner of his expression. "Bar opens at 4, he said. "Be here at 3:30. Behind her, she heard someone at one of the tables make a low sound somewhere between a laugh and a skeptical exhale. She didn't turn around. She thanked Victor, took her folder back, and walked out the same way she'd walked in. She didn't let herself breathe until she was back in her car. Then she pressed her hands flat on her thighs and sat with her eyes closed for a moment and thought, okay, what comes next? What came next was 3:30. She showed up at 3:20. The door was unlocked and the bar was empty except for Victor, who was going through invoices at the end of the counter, and a younger man, not young, late 30s maybe, who was restocking bottles on the shelf behind the bar without looking up when she came in. Victor introduced her to the basics in the first hour with the economy of someone who didn't believe in wasting words. The register, the taps, the layout of the back room, the policy on tabs, and the policy on trouble. He told her the prices, the regulars, the drinks most people ordered without looking at the menu. He told her the rule he lived by: respect is not given because someone needs it, it's earned by what you do when things get hard. The younger man, the one restocking bottles, never introduced himself. He moved around the bar with an efficiency that told her he'd been doing this for years, knew every inch of the space, and had strong opinions about how things should be organized that he expressed through his arrangement of the bottles rather than through words. It was Victor who told her the man's name later after he'd left to deal with something out back. "That's Cole Bennett," Victor said, without looking up from what he was doing. "He's been with this chapter for 12 years. He doesn't trust new people easily." "I noticed," Emily said. He has his reasons," Victor said, and that was all he said about it. By 4:15, the bar was filling up. The men who came in were not what Emily had spent 11 days of fear constructing in her imagination. That was the first thing, not a relief, not a dramatic revelation, just a slow, quiet recalibration of what she was actually seeing as opposed to what she'd been told to see. Big Mike came in at 4:25, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, a man so physically imposing that he seemed to alter the geometry of whatever room he entered. He ordered a beer, and while Emily was getting it, he pulled out his phone, squinted at it with the expression of a man who'd never fully made peace with the technology, and turned it toward her. "My granddaughter's birthday yesterday," he said. 5 years old. "You see how big she's getting." Emily looked at the photo, a little girl in a pink dress with her face entirely covered in frosting, laughing so hard her eyes had disappeared. "She's beautiful," Emily said, and she meant it. Big Mike put the phone away with the careful reverence of someone returning something precious to its place. "She's going to run the world someday," he said. "She already runs me." He took his beer to a table where 3 other men were waiting for him. She heard him laugh before he even sat down. By 6 o'clock, she had pulled beers, mixed drinks, handled 6 simultaneous orders without losing track, deflected 2 mildly flirtatious comments with a kind of easy, unbothered humor that communicated, "I heard you. I'm not offended," and we're moving on. And she had started to understand something about this room that the town of Silver Creek had gotten wrong. These men had a code. It wasn't the code she'd grown up learning in school or church or the movies. It was more specific, more interior, less concerned with how it looked from the outside. They were intensely loyal. They were honest to the point of bluntness. They didn't perform emotions, but when they had them, they were real. And they watched her the way people watch someone who is doing a job in a place that matters to them, with the alert attention of people who care about the outcome. She was being evaluated. She knew that. She wasn't a person to them, yet she was a question that hadn't been answered. She decided to be her own answer. The moment that changed, things came at 8:47. She remembered the time because she looked at the clock 30 seconds before it happened, doing a mental inventory of the bar, who needed refills, who was getting loud in the good way versus the bad way, what the temperature of the room was, the way her first manager years ago had taught her to do every half hour. The door opened and a man walked in who was not a regular. She knew it immediately, not from anything specific, just from the way the room responded, the slight shift in the ambient attention, the way a couple of the men near the door glanced up and then at each other. The man was in his 40s, heavy set with the specific confidence of someone who was accustomed to getting his way through the path of least resistance and had never had to develop a backup plan. He sat at the bar. He ordered a whiskey. She poured it and set it in front of him and started to move away when his hand came across the bar and grabbed her forearm. Not hard, not violent exactly, but deliberate, possessive, the kind of grip that was a statement. She stopped. The room noticed. Everything she'd felt in 11 days, the rejections, the 250 coffees that ate into $63, The sleeping, sitting up, the ache of being invisible in the places that were supposed to be public. The slow, corrosive experience of needing something from people who looked at her like she was a problem. They didn't want all of that compressed into the 3 seconds she stood there with this man's hand on her arm. She looked at him. She said very calmly, "Let go of my arm." He didn't. He smiled. The kind of smile that expected an audience and expected that audience to be on his side. "Relax," he said. "I just want to." I said, "Let go of my arm." Her voice didn't shake. She was slightly surprised by that again, the same surprise she'd felt standing in front of Victor, the discovery that whatever fear she was carrying hadn't reached her voice. The room was completely still. And then Victor Hayes appeared. She didn't see where he came from. He was just suddenly there, standing beside the man at the bar, and his presence in that moment was the most efficient thing Emily had ever witnessed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch the man. He simply stood there and said with complete evenness, "You need to let go of that woman's arm, settle your tab, and leave my bar." The man looked at Victor. Whatever calculation he ran, it concluded quickly. He let go. He put cash on the bar, more than the drink cost, and left without another word. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. Not dramatically, just returned to itself. Conversations restarted. Someone went back to the pool table. Victor looked at Emily. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "Thank you." Victor shook his head slightly, like she'd thanked him for something that didn't require thanks. "Took you about 2 seconds to handle that yourself," he said. "I just finished it." He picked up a glass and started polishing it. "Being scared doesn't make you weak. Makes you human. What you did next is what matters." Emily turned back to the bar. From the corner of her eye, she saw Cole Bennett, who had been watching from the far end of the counter. He looked at her for a moment, not with warmth, not yet, but with something that hadn't been there before, like a question that had shifted slightly into something more like an observation. He looked away. She went back to work. What? She drove to her car that night at closing time, 1:30 in the morning, her feet hurting, her brain buzzing with the names and faces and drink preferences she'd been memorizing all night, and sat behind the wheel and thought about what she was feeling. Not relief exactly, not happiness, something more careful than that. Something that said, "This might be real, but don't lean on it yet." She counted her tips on the dashboard. $94, more than she'd made in the previous week combined. She put the bills in her wallet and looked out the windshield at the parking lot of the Black Viper, at the motorcycles that were still there because their owners were still inside, and the lights were still on somewhere in the back. She thought about Big Mike's granddaughter in the pink dress covered in frosting. She thought about Victor's voice saying, "What you do next is what matters." She thought about Cole Bennett watching her from the end of the bar with those unreadable brown eyes. She pulled out her phone and found Sandra's number. The waitress had given it to her that morning just to check in and send her a text. "First shift done. Got through it." Sandra replied in 3 minutes. How was it really? Emily thought about how to answer that. "Complicated," she typed back. "Real. More real than I expected." She put the phone away and pulled her jacket over herself as a blanket and settled back into the driver's seat. The desert night was cold the way desert nights are, dropping 30 degrees from the afternoon, like the sky had been waiting all day to exhale. She closed her eyes. She thought, tomorrow, you do what comes next. The first 2 weeks were a curriculum. Every shift taught her something the one before it hadn't. She learned which men wanted to talk and which men wanted to drink in peace, and how to tell the difference inside the first 30 seconds. She learned that the jukebox had a specific order of songs that the regulars had established over years, and that deviating from it without permission was taken more seriously than she'd initially understood. She learned that Big Mike was a surprisingly sophisticated cook who brought food sometimes and left it in the kitchen with no ceremony and no expectation of acknowledgement, and that the acknowledgement was given anyway because this was a room full of people who paid attention. She learned that Victor Hayes had a daughter in Portland he talked to every Sunday morning before the bar opened, and that these calls were private and inviolable, and that everyone in the chapter understood this without it ever being said. She learned that the chapter had, over the years, paid the emergency medical bills of 3 families in Silver Creek who had nowhere else to turn, that they'd rebuilt the back porch of an elderly woman named Mrs. Paulson who lived on the edge of town after a storm took it, that they ran a toy drive every November that donated to children in the county, and that they did it quietly without press or recognition, because that wasn't the point. The town saw the leather and the motorcycles and the reputation and built a wall out of it. The men behind that wall had been building something different the whole time. Emily learned all of this not from being told it directly, but from watching and listening and being in the room long enough that the room forgot she was new. Cole Bennett did not forget she was new. He wasn't openly hostile. He was too controlled for that, too self-disciplined. But he maintained a specific, careful distance that communicated, "I see you, I'm not ready to trust you." He worked alongside her without friction because he was professional, but there was a line between working alongside someone and accepting them, and Cole knew exactly where that line was and stood on his side of it with the patience of someone who had learned patience the hard way. She asked Victor about it at the end of her second week, during the quiet hour after the bar closed, when it was just the two of them finishing the cleanup. "Cole doesn't trust easily," she said. It wasn't a complaint. She was just trying to understand the map. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "About 6 years ago, we had someone in the chapter we trusted for a long time. Turned out he'd been passing information to people who wanted to see this place shut down. It cost us." He paused. "It cost us more than I'll get into." Cole lost someone because of it. Not to violence, to the aftermath, the kind of loss that doesn't have a clean explanation. He set down the glass he'd been drying. He's not suspicious because he's paranoid. He's careful because being careful failed him once, and he couldn't afford to let it fail him again. Emily absorbed that. "He thinks I could be the same," she said. "He thinks anyone could be the same," Victor said. "That's what that kind of betrayal does. It doesn't give you a name. It gives you a category." She nodded slowly. "What do we do with that?" Victor picked up another glass. "What you've been doing," he said. "You show up, you do the work. You don't ask him to stop being who he is. You just be who you are. Eventually those two things will either fit together or they won't." Emily thought about that for the rest of the night. The moment she understood the real stakes arrived without announcement, the way important moments almost always do. It was the end of her third week. A Tuesday afternoon, the bar quiet, only 4 or 5 people in the place, when a man in a pressed shirt walked through the door. He wasn't a biker. Wasn't from around here either. She could tell from the shoes, the haircut, the way he held himself like he was used to rooms paying attention to him when he entered rather than him paying attention to the room. He asked for the owner. Victor came out from the back. The man introduced himself, Richard Wallace. He had a card which he offered, and Victor took it without looking at it. Wallace said he was with a development firm that was working in partnership with several county stakeholders on a revitalization project for this section of Route 9. He used the word opportunity 4 times in the first 2 minutes. He talked about rising property values, improved traffic patterns, and a plan that would benefit the whole community. Victor listened to all of it with the same stillness he brought to everything. Then he said, "What does that have to do with my bar?" Wallace smiled the way people smile when they've practiced the answer to the question they knew was coming. "Well, obviously, a project of this scope requires some reconfiguration of the existing landscape. We'd be prepared to offer a very fair market value for the property." "The bar isn't for sale," Victor said. "Still pleasant, still even. Just know." Wallace's smile stayed in place. Of course. Just something to think about. These things have a way of developing." He glanced around the bar in a way that was meant to look casual, but wasn't. "Are you aware your current licensing is up for renewal next quarter? These processes can get complicated, especially if there are any outstanding compliance questions." "Is there a compliance question?" Victor asked. "Not that I know of," Wallace said. "Yet." He left his card on the bar and walked out. Victor picked up the card and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down. Emily had been wiping down the far end of the bar close enough to hear everything quiet enough that Wallace had either forgotten she was there or decided she didn't matter. She looked at Victor. "That was a threat," she said. "Yes," Victor said. "He's going to try to shut you down." Victor nodded slowly. "Probably been." He looked at the door where Wallace had gone out. "The question is how." Cole Bennett walked in from the back room. He'd been there the whole time she realized, listening from just out of sight. He looked at the card on the bar. Then he looked at Emily. The look lasted 1 second longer than his usual assessment. Something in it said, "We'll see." Emily held his gaze. She thought, "Yes, we will." That night, she lay awake in the back seat of her car. She'd started sleeping in the back seat again, more comfortable, and stared at the ceiling fabric and thought about Richard Wallace and the way he'd said the word "yet." Not that I know of. Yet. She knew that word. She'd heard versions of it her whole life, in landlords' offices and HR meetings, in the careful language of people who wanted you to know they had power without proving it too early. It was the language of people who were accustomed to getting what they wanted by making you feel like resistance was its own kind of evidence against you. She thought about the 3 applicants before her who had walked through the Black Viper's door and not stayed. She thought about the rumors and the reputation and the wall the town had built. And she thought, what if the wall isn't there to keep the town safe from them? What if it's there to keep them isolated enough that when something comes for them, nobody stands up? She didn't have proof of anything yet, but she understood in the way that people understand things at 1 a.m, in the back of a car in a desert town, that what she'd walked into was bigger than a job. She just didn't know yet how much bigger, or what it was going to cost her to stay. She woke up the next morning with a crick in her neck and a decision already formed in her chest before she was fully conscious. She wasn't leaving. That was the whole of it. Not a complicated thought, not a reasoned argument she'd built in her sleep, just a fact that had settled into her while she wasn't paying attention, the way certainty sometimes arrives, not through thinking, but through the body deciding before the mind catches up. She wasn't leaving the Black Viper. She wasn't going to let Richard Wallace's pressed shirt and practiced smile and that one word "yet" chase her out of the only place in Silver Creek that had actually let her work. She sat up, pulled her jacket on, and drove to the library before it opened, waiting in the parking lot with the engine off to save gas, thinking about what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out. What she knew: Wallace wanted the property. He'd made that clear with the kind of clarity that hides itself inside politeness, the way a knife stays dangerous even when it's wrapped in cloth. He'd mentioned licensing and compliance not as facts, but as possibilities. Not that I know of yet, which meant he didn't currently have anything to use, which meant he was going to go looking or manufacturing. What she didn't know: how far along he was, how many people he'd already talked to, whether the chapter understood the full shape of what was coming at them or just the outline. The library opened at 9. She went inside and used one of the public computers and spent 2 hours reading everything she could find about Richard Wallace. What she found wasn't nothing. He had a consulting firm registered in Carson City. He was listed as an advisor to 2 county development projects in the past 4 years, both of which had involved properties that initially resisted sale, and then, after a period of what the local news described in vague terms as regulatory complications, had changed hands. One article from 3 years ago mentioned a small restaurant owner who claimed Wallace had orchestrated a series of health code citations that turned out to be baseless, but by the time the appeals cleared, the owner had run out of money to keep fighting. The restaurant was now a parking structure. She printed the articles, 3 pages. She folded them into her jacket pocket and drove to the Black Viper. It was 10:30 in the morning. The bar didn't open until 4, but Victor's truck was in the lot. It was always there, she'd come to understand, because Victor essentially lived here in the ways that mattered, even if he technically had a house somewhere. She knocked on the back door. He opened it after a moment, coffee in hand, looking unsurprised to see her. "You found something," he said. "Maybe," she said. "I'm not sure yet, but I think you need to see this." He let her in. She spread the printed articles on the table in the back room and walked him through it: the pattern, the 2 other properties, the restaurant owner, whose citations had been baseless, but whose business had died anyway from the cost of fighting them. Victor read slowly, the way he did everything, and she watched his face and saw almost nothing change in it except something around the eyes that she was starting to learn how to read. It was the look he got when he was taking something seriously. When he finished, he sat back. "This is what he does." "Looks like it," she said. "He finds a pressure point and he applies it until something breaks. He doesn't need the citations to stick. He just needs them to cost you enough that selling becomes easier than fighting." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you find all this in one morning?" "Library," she said, "and public records, a couple of local newspaper archives." She paused. "I used to process a lot of paperwork in my last job. You learn to read the pattern under the words." He looked at her in the way he sometimes did, assessing, but without hostility, more like he was updating something. All right, he said. I need to make some calls. I'd like you to leave these here. She left the papers. She drove back to the dollar store parking lot, ate the granola bar she'd been rationing since yesterday, and let herself feel for a few minutes something that was almost pride. Then she put the car in drive and thought about what to do until her shift started. She went back to the library and kept reading. Cole Bennett arrived at the Black Viper that afternoon 40 minutes earlier than usual. Emily knew this because she'd also arrived early. She'd started coming in at 3 instead of 3:30 because the extra half hour was useful, and because she'd realized that the setup time was when Victor talked most openly when the bar's defenses were down a little, and that being present for those conversations was its own kind of education. Cole walked in and saw her behind the bar arranging glasses and stopped for half a second in a way that was so controlled most people wouldn't have caught it. She caught it because she'd been watching him for 3 weeks. He said nothing. He went to the back room. He was in there for 20 minutes, presumably talking to Victor. When he came out, he went to the far end of the bar and started doing his own restocking with the focused energy of a man who has just received information he needs to think about, but doesn't have time to sit down and think about it properly. He didn't look at her. She didn't push. 20 minutes later, Big Mike came in, and then Ricky, a compact, quick man in his 50s who drove a burgundy bike and had the laugh of someone who found the world genuinely funny, and then 3 others, and the pre-shift quiet broke into the specific noise of people who were comfortable with each other. Emily worked. She was pulling a draft for Ricky when Cole appeared at her section of the bar. Not ordering, just standing there leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, looking at some middle distance that happened to be in her direction. She finished pouring, delivered the beer, wiped the tap, and looked at him. Waiting. Victor showed me what you found this morning, he said. Okay, she said. Why'd you go looking? She considered the question. Because I heard him say yet, and I knew what that meant. Cole's jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was processing something he hadn't expected. Most people would have stayed out of it. I know, she said. I'm not most people. He looked at her for a moment. Then, what do you think he's going to go after first? She hadn't expected him to ask her. Not him, not yet. She kept her expression neutral because showing him that the question mattered to her would be wrong. This wasn't about her, and she knew instinctively that Cole would distrust any answer that smelled like self-interest. Licensing, she said. It's the cleanest lever. If he can generate enough paperwork problems, even ones that don't stick, he creates a situation where you're spending money on lawyers instead of operations. He doesn't have to win. He just has to make losing too expensive to keep fighting. Cole said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with those flat, careful eyes. Then he pushed off the counter and walked back to the other end of the bar. She went back to work. She told herself that was progress. She almost believed it. 4 days later, the first inspection arrived. It was a Thursday, which meant the bar had been busy the night before, and Emily had slept in her car until 9, and then spent 3 hours at the laundromat running her clothes through because she couldn't keep putting it off. She was back at the Black Viper by 2 earlier than usual because something in her had started pulling her there on her off hours in a way she didn't fully understand yet and wasn't ready to examine. The inspector was a man named Gerald 50s, the kind of bureaucratic professionalism that had become its own personality. He had a clipboard and he went through the bar with the thoroughness of someone who had been told to be thorough. He checked the fire exits. He checked the ventilation. He checked the storage temperatures and the alcohol licensing and the capacity documentation. Victor followed him through the whole thing without comment, answering questions, when asked, producing documents that were organized and current and correct. Emily watched from behind the bar. She watched Gerald make notes. She watched his face for the specific look she'd seen before in landlords and HR managers, in people who come into a space looking for something and are not pleased when they don't find it. Gerald had that look when he left. He hadn't found anything, but he'd written 3 pages of notes and he'd said pleasantly that there might be a follow-up. Victor stood at the door after Gerald left and watched the county vehicle drive out of the lot. His back was to Emily, but she could read the set of his shoulders. That's one, he said to no one in particular. He didn't find anything, Emily said. He didn't need to find anything today, Victor said. He turned around. His face was entirely composed, which was its own kind of alarm. He needed to establish a visit record. Next time they can say there was a prior inspection that raised concerns. The time after that, the concerns become findings. Emily had read about this exact pattern in one of the articles from the library. "We need a lawyer," she said. "Working on it," Victor said. Just go. The night after the inspection was one of those shifts that tested everything. The bar was loud and full, and Emily was moving fast, 3 people deep at the counter, orders coming in faster than she could process the particular chaos of a full house on a weekend that didn't care how many problems she was carrying. She was in it completely the way she got when the work demanded total presence. And total presence was actually a relief because for those hours there was no car and no $63 and no Richard Wallace. There was only the job in front of her. She was in the middle of making change for a man named Denny when she heard the voice. It was the same man from 3 weeks ago, the one who'd grabbed her arm. She heard his voice before she saw him, that particular cadence of a man who's had enough to drink, that his confidence has outrun his judgment, and he's stopped caring about the distance between what he's thinking and what he's saying out loud. She looked up. He was at the end of the bar. He hadn't seen her yet. He was talking to the man next to him, something loud and broad, the way people talk when they want the room to notice them. Then he looked up and saw her. His expression went through 3 things in about a second and a half: recognition, calculation, and then something uglier, the particular resentment of a man who'd been embarrassed and had been waiting for an opportunity to address it on his own terms. He started moving toward her section of the bar. She kept her hands moving. She was making a gin and tonic, and she finished making it and slid it to the woman who'd ordered it and picked up the next order from her mental queue and did not change her face or her pace or anything about the way she was standing. He reached the bar. "Hey," he said. "Remember me?" "I do," she said. She was already pulling the next draft. "What can I get you?" He blinked, thrown slightly by the lack of visible reaction. "That's it. That's all you've got. I've got a full bar to run," she said. She set the beer down, took cash from the man who'd ordered it, made change. "If you want a drink, I'll get you one. If you want something else, you're in the wrong place." His jaw tightened. "You think because you work here now you're—" "I think," she said, and she kept her voice completely level, "that you should decide what you're drinking. Is there a problem?" Not a question. Cole's voice from directly behind the man. Emily watched the man's posture change, that involuntary recalibration that happens when the physics of a situation suddenly shifts, and the body knows it before the mind does. He turned around slowly. Cole was standing close, not aggressively, not with his hands anywhere near anyone, just standing there, the way Cole always stood, which was like something that had deep roots and was not moving. "No problem," the man said. "Good," Cole said. "Then I'd suggest ordering something or moving on." The man ordered something. He drank it at the far end of the bar and left 20 minutes later without looking at Emily again. Cole went back to wherever he'd come from. He didn't look at her either. But 10 minutes later, when the rush had thinned a little and she was wiping down her section, she found a glass of water on the counter next to her, the kind of thing you pour for yourself on a busy shift and keep forgetting to drink, and which Cole had apparently noticed she didn't have. She picked it up, drank half of it. She thought something is shifting. She thought, don't read too much into it. She thought, drink the water and get back to work. She got back to work. The second inspection arrived 10 days after the first. This time it was 2 inspectors, not 1. A man and a woman, both with clipboards, both with the specific energy of people who had been briefed on what they were looking for. They spent 90 minutes in the bar. They found 2 things: a light bulb in the back storage room that was below the required lumens for that type of space, something that hadn't come up in Gerald's inspection, and a filing date discrepancy on a liquor license renewal from 4 years ago that had been processed and approved, but whose original submission timestamp didn't match the county's system records. The light bulb was replaced before they left the building. Victor had one in the drawer. The filing discrepancy was going to require documentation. The inspectors left a written notice. Victor read it at the bar while Emily stood next to him reading it over his shoulder. The language was careful and bureaucratic, and beneath the careful bureaucratic language was something very clear. This was being escalated. "He moved faster than I expected," Victor said. "He's done this before," Emily said. "He knows the timeline." Victor set the notice down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and stepped to the back room. Emily stood at the bar alone and looked at the notice and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't exactly fear. It was more like recognition. The recognition of a pattern she'd lived through before in smaller versions in apartments and bums, and every institution that had the power to make her life difficult and exercise that power because it cost them nothing. And because people like her, isolated and without resources, usually couldn't fight back long enough to make the cost worth bearing. The difference, she thought, was that she wasn't alone here. Or she wasn't sure yet, but she was less alone than she'd been 3 weeks ago. And 3 weeks ago, she'd been almost completely alone, and that difference had to mean something. She picked up a rag and started wiping down the bar. She was still wiping when Cole came out from the back hallway, and she could tell from the way he was walking that he'd heard the news and had already processed it and arrived at something. He stopped next to her. For a moment, he just stood there. Then he said, "Victor wants to call a chapter meeting." "When?" she said. "Tonight, after close." She nodded. She understood this meant she would not be in the meeting. It wasn't her place, and she didn't expect it to be. She started to move away, and Cole said, "He wants you there." She stopped. "Victor," she said. "Victor," Cole said. His voice was flat, giving nothing away about whether this was something he agreed with. She turned to face him. "Okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been studying for weeks, the one that was almost something, and then pulled back. "You found the pattern before any of us did," he said. "That's the only reason you're being asked." "I know," she said. "Don't make more of it than that." "I'm not," she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded and walked away. She went back to the bar. She let the shift take her, and she worked it completely. And underneath everything she was feeling, something she didn't have a clean name for. Something between being trusted and being tested and not being entirely sure which one was actually happening. After her last call, after the cleaning was done, and the chairs were up, and the last of the regulars had filed out, Emily sat at the bar with 12 men she'd known for less than a month and listened while Victor laid out what they were facing. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't inflate it. He laid it out like a map. Here is where we are. Here is what we know. Here is what we think is coming. The filing discrepancy from the liquor license was a small thing on its own, but combined with the 2 inspections in less than 2 weeks, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was feeding information and focus to whoever was directing the inspectors. The complaints that had triggered both inspections had come from sources the county wouldn't disclose. "Anonymous complaints," Victor said. "Both of them." "Someone who knows this place," Big Mike said. He said it slowly, not accusingly, just laying it alongside the other facts. The room was quiet. Emily understood what was not being said. An anonymous complaint from someone with access, with knowledge of the specific dates and details that would make a complaint credible, meant someone connected to the chapter, or connected enough to know things they shouldn't. Cole was looking at the table. Emily watched him and understood something. This was the specific shape of the fear he'd been carrying for 6 years, not paranoia. Memory. The last time this had happened, someone inside their circle had been the source, and now it was happening again. And she had arrived right before it started. Victor looked at her from across the table. "You've been here a month. You want to tell us anything?" The question was asked without accusation, but it landed in the room with weight because it needed to be asked. "I found the information at the library," Emily said. "Public records. Anyone could have found it." "That's not what I asked," Victor said. She looked at him. Then she looked at Cole, who was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between watching and waiting, and something that might have been buried under everything else, something that looked almost like hoping she was going to say the right thing. "I came here because I had $63 and no one else would give me a job," she said. "That's the whole story. I don't have anything to do with Wallace. I don't know anyone in this town. I've been sleeping in my car in the parking lot behind the dollar store since I got here, which I'm telling you now because it's the truth and because I'd rather tell you than have you find out some other way and think I was hiding something." Silence. Big Mike looked at Victor. Ricky looked at his hands. Cole looked at Emily and she looked back, and the room existed for about 5 seconds in the kind of silence that is not empty but full of people recalculating, re-seeing, making new room in their understanding for something that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. It was Cole who spoke first. "You've been sleeping in your car," he said. Not a question, not with judgment, just saying it out loud. Yes, she said. Something crossed his face, something fast and hard, and directed inward like a man who has just realized he's been carrying a conclusion that didn't fit the evidence. He looked away. Victor said, "That's not going to continue." Emily opened her mouth. "We have a storage room with a couch that folds out," Victor said. "It's not much, but it's here and it's inside, and it locks from the inside, and until you have somewhere else to go, it's yours." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I don't need Emily," Victor said. Just her name. Said the way her mother used to say it when she was making an argument that wasn't worth making. She stopped. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Victor nodded. He looked around the table. "Back to the problem," he said. "We need to find out who's feeding Wallace information, and we need to do it before the next inspection, because the next one won't be about light bulbs." The meeting went on for another hour. By the time it ended, Emily had a place to sleep, a chapter that knew her real situation, and a problem that was bigger than any of them had fully mapped yet. She lay on the fold-out couch in the storage room that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything. She thought about Cole's face when she said she'd been sleeping in her car. She thought about the way something in him had shifted. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to see it. She thought about the anonymous complaints and the inspections and the filing discrepancy and the restaurant owner who'd run out of money fighting back and whose building was now a parking structure. She thought Wallace is counting on you being too broke and too isolated to last long enough to matter. She thought he doesn't know what you walked away from to get here. She thought he doesn't know you've been operating on nothing for months and you're still here. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she slept in a room with 4 walls. She thought just before sleep took her, this isn't over. This is just starting. And she was right. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that the man feeding information to Richard Wallace was someone who ate at the Black Viper's bar twice a week, someone who had been trusted for years, someone who had made a decision 6 months ago out of a desperation that wasn't so different from the desperation that had walked Emily through that door. She didn't know yet that the betrayal was already in the room, but she was going to find out. The betrayal had a name. It took 11 days to find it. Those 11 days were not quiet. They were the kind of days that look ordinary. From the outside bar opens, bar closes. People drink, people leave. But underneath the surface routine, everything was running hotter and faster and with a specific tension that didn't release at the end of any shift. Emily felt it every time she came out of the storage room in the morning. She felt it in the way the men talked to each other, the way conversations stopped and restarted when someone new walked in, the way Victor's phone calls got longer and happened more often out of earshot. The chapter was watching itself, and that kind of watching turned inward suspicious. Searching for the wound inside the body was its own kind of damage. Emily understood this in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She'd grown up watching her mother navigate workplaces where someone was always angling for something, where trust was a currency that spent fast and rebuilt slow, and where the worst thing wasn't the conflict itself, but the atmosphere that preceded it, that tightening, that second-guessing, that particular exhaustion of not knowing who to be fully honest with. It corroded things, not all at once, just steadily, the way water finds the crack that's already there and works it wider over time. She kept working, she kept showing up. She did her job with the same focus she'd brought on day one, and she watched and she listened, and she said almost nothing about what she was piecing together because she didn't have enough pieces yet to build anything solid and half-built. Things could do more damage than silence. The third inspection arrived on a Tuesday morning. Emily was behind the bar when they walked in. Even though the bar wasn't open yet, she'd taken to spending mornings here instead of at the library, partly because the storage room couch was genuinely the best sleep she'd had in months, and partly because she'd realized that the mornings were when Victor processed things out loud if there was someone willing to listen without filling every silence with their own noise. 3 inspectors this time. The 2 from before, plus a third, she hadn't seen a younger man with the look of someone who'd been sent along to learn how this was done. They had a new set of complaints on record, 6 of them all anonymous, all filed within the past 8 days. Noise violations, alleged after-hours service, a claim that the parking lot had been the site of an altercation that was never reported. The altercation claim was the one that made Victor's jaw tighten, and Emily caught it because she was watching. There had been no altercation in the parking lot. She would have known. She was here almost every night, which meant either the claim was fabricated or someone was describing something that happened so long ago it had been retrieved for ammunition, and this was the possibility that sat cold as someone was inventing events with specific enough detail to sound credible. The inspectors went through the bar. They checked everything they'd checked before and several things they hadn't. Victor answered every question. He produced every document requested. He was so completely in control of his own demeanor that watching him was like watching a man defuse a bomb with his hands entirely steady, and the steadiness itself was a kind of courage. When they left, the young inspector paused at the door. He was the only one who looked uncomfortable. He glanced back at Emily, who was wiping down the bar with the focused patience of someone who had decided that the most powerful thing she could do right now was not react. He looked like he wanted to say something. Then he followed the others out. Victor stood at the door. 6 complaints in 8 days, he said. Someone's escalating the timeline, Emily said. On, which means something changed. Either he has a deadline or he's worried about something slowing him down. Or both, Victor said. Cole came in from the back, and Emily could tell he'd been listening. He had a way of appearing in the edge of a conversation just after the moment it had most mattered, and she'd stopped being surprised by it. He looked at Victor. Jimmy didn't show this morning. The name sat in the air for a second. Emily had been at this Black Viper for over a month. She knew Jimmy. Jimmy Reyes was 47, heavy-set, with a silver braid and a laugh that arrived before he did and stayed after he left. He'd been a chapter associate for 9 years. Not a full patch member, but present, trusted in the way that proximity and time build trust. The kind of trust that doesn't get examined because it doesn't seem to need examination. He ate at the bar twice a week. He knew the schedule, the layout, the staff, the licensing cycle. He knew almost everything. He didn't call, Cole said. Victor didn't say anything. He just looked at the door where the inspectors had gone. Emily set down the rag she was holding. When did he last come in? Cole looked at her. 3 nights ago. Was he here the night the second inspection notice came? Cole was quiet for a moment, then slowly, yes. She picked up the rag again. She didn't say what she was thinking because she didn't need to. Victor was already thinking the same thing, and Cole was already thinking it, and the 3 of them stood in the quiet bar with the information settling around them like something that had been in the room the whole time and had just become visible. I need to make a call, Victor said. He went to the back. Cole didn't move. Emily started wiping down the bar with the systematic attention of someone who needs to do something with her hands. She worked her way toward Cole's end of the counter. She didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her, and that was fine. There was a kind of communication that worked better without eye contact, when you were both facing the same direction, and the words could land without the extra weight of being watched. You think it's him, she said. I don't know, Cole said. But you think it could be. A pause. I think the pattern fits. She nodded. If it is him, if he's the one feeding information to Wallace, that doesn't mean the chapter is broken. It means one person made a terrible decision, probably for reasons that felt like survival at the time. Cole turned and looked at her then, because she'd said the unexpected thing, the thing that cut at an angle to what he'd probably expected her to say. That's a generous read, he said. It's a human rhythm, she said. People don't usually do things like this because they're evil. They do them because they're cornered and scared, and someone offered them a door that looked like a way out. Something moved across Cole's face, something that was almost personal, almost like she'd described a feeling he recognized. He looked away again. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, she said. It doesn't, but it changes what you do about it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you talk like someone who's been in a corner. I have been, she said. I am. That's why I recognize it. He didn't respond to that, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, a loosening so small was barely visible, the kind of thing that happens when a person lets go of a posture they've been holding for longer than they realized. Hi, Victor found Jimmy at noon. He didn't go looking for him. Jimmy came to the bar, which was either courage or desperation, or some specific mixture of both that happens when a person has been carrying a secret so heavy that the weight of it finally becomes worse than whatever comes from putting it down. Emily was in the back when she heard the door. She stayed where she was. This was not her moment to be present for, and she knew it. She heard voices, Victor's low and controlled, Jimmy's, which started defensive and then cracked within about 4 minutes into something that was painful to be near, even from another room. She didn't listen to the words. She focused on the dishes she was washing and let the sounds blur into tone rather than language. It went on for about 30 minutes. When it got quiet, she heard boots on the floor and then the door, and then nothing. Victor came into the back room. He looked like a man who had just done something very difficult in exactly the way it needed to be done, which is never easy and never feels like victory. He sat down. "It was Jimmy," he said. Emily turned off the water and dried her hands and sat across from him. "He's been in debt for 2 years, Victor said. Medical debt. His wife had surgery 18 months ago. The insurance didn't cover what they said it would. They've been trying to manage it since. Wallace found him 8 months ago. Not the other way around. Wallace came to him. Knew about the debt, offered to make it go away in exchange for information." "How much information?" Emily said. "Enough," Victor said. "The licensing renewal dates. The complaint process. Who to call, what to say." Wallace provided the complaints. Jimmy just provided the details that made them credible. She was quiet for a moment. "Is Jimmy telling you this voluntarily?" "He came here to tell me," Victor said, "before I came to him." He rubbed the side of his face. "He's been trying to find a way out of it for 3 months. Wallace told him once he started stopping would be a problem." "Of course he did," Emily said. Victor looked at her. "You don't seem surprised." "By any of it," she said. "Not the debt, not the way Wallace approached him, not the way Wallace kept him locked in." She looked at the table. "This is how he operates. He finds the person in the room who's already underwater, and he throws them a rope that's also a chain." Victor said nothing. "What does Jimmy have?" she said. "What did he keep?" Victor looked at her with the specific expression of a man who is recalibrating something in real time. "What do you mean?" "If I were Jimmy," she said, "and I was in a situation like that, locked in, no way out, dealing with someone like Wallace, I would keep something. Not for leverage, not necessarily, just because the only thing you have when you're powerless is information, and you hold on to it the way you hold on to anything that might matter someday." Victor stared at her. Then he got up and went back to the front of the bar where Jimmy was still sitting. Emily sat at the table and waited and did not let herself think about what would happen if she was wrong. She was not wrong. Jimmy had kept everything. Not on his phone. He was smarter than that, or more paranoid, which in this situation was the same thing. He'd kept records the old way, printed emails, handwritten notes with dates and dollar amounts, a photograph of a check made out to cash in an amount that corresponded to a date, and a set of complaints that could now be matched to a specific inspection visit. He had them at his house in a shoebox under his workbench, and he gave Victor the address, and Victor sent Cole. Cole came back 45 minutes later with a shoebox. He set it on the bar. Victor opened it. The 3 of them stood around it. Victor, Cole, Emily, and looked at what was inside, and what was inside was the entire architecture of Richard Wallace's scheme, laid out in handwriting and timestamps and financial records, and 2 printed email chains that connected Wallace's private address to a county official whose name appeared on the inspection paperwork. Cole looked up from the box. He looked at Emily. "You knew he'd have something," Cole said. "I hoped," she said. She thought about how to answer that. "Because Jimmy didn't come here to confess because he felt guilty," she said. "He came here because he wanted out, and you don't want out unless you have something to bargain with. He knew what he was holding. He was waiting for the moment it was safe to use it." Cole looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not the careful flatness she'd spent weeks reading. It was something more open than that, something that looked like the face of a man who has spent years building a wall and has just looked up from a particularly stubborn section of it and noticed that the landscape on the other side is not what he assumed. "You're not what I thought you were," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was just true, and he said it like truth without ceremony. "I know what you thought," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes," she said, "you were." Victor was already on the phone. What happened next moved faster than any of them had prepared for. And in situations like this, fast is both the best thing and the most dangerous thing, because speed compresses the margin for error. Victor's lawyer was a woman named Denise Morales, 61 years old, who had been practicing in Carson City for 30 years, and who had the specific energy of someone who has spent 3 decades being underestimated and long ago decided to use that as a professional tool. She arrived at the Black Viper the next morning, with a leather bag and a yellow legal pad, and she sat at the bar and went through the shoebox for 2 hours without once looking up from what she was reading. When she finished, she looked up. This, she said, is significantly more than I expected. Good significantly or bad significantly, Ricky asked. He'd been hovering. Good, she said. The email chain connecting Wallace to Commissioner Hartley is exposure he cannot manage quietly. This is the kind of thing that ends careers and opens investigations. She turned a page over. The financial records showing payment to your man for information that creates a direct line between Wallace and the orchestrated inspection campaign, which means the inspections themselves were conducted in bad faith, which means the notices they generated are challengeable at the administrative level. What does all of that mean in practice? Cole asked. Denise looked at him. It means that if we move correctly, we can file for an emergency injunction to halt any further regulatory action against this property while the underlying conduct is investigated. We can simultaneously file a complaint with the County Ethics Board regarding Commissioner Hartley's involvement, and we can have a very direct conversation with Richard Wallace's legal team about what we're prepared to do with this information in a public forum if this doesn't stop now. Victor looked at the shoebox. And Jimmy, Denise was quiet for a moment. Your man made a choice that hurt people he cares about. He also came forward with evidence that may save your business and expose a corruption scheme that's taken other people's properties. Those two things coexist. She paused. Whether there are legal consequences for him depends on whether Wallace's people want to open that door, which they won't, because opening that door means they walk through it first. Something in the room shifted. It wasn't relief, not yet. Relief requires certainty, and they weren't there. But it was something adjacent to it, the feeling of being handed back a weapon you'd thought was lost. Emily was standing at the far end of the bar, not part of this conversation, not inserting herself because she understood that she was a month old here, and Denise Morales was handling something that had decades of weight behind it. But she was listening, and she was watching Cole. He was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and his eyes on Denise's legal pad, and she could see him processing everything in that characteristic way of his thorough control, not allowing himself to feel anything until he'd finished thinking. She had spent weeks learning the difference between Cole Bennett shutting down and Cole Bennett working something out, and she was watching him work something out now. After Denise left, Cole found Emily in the back room. She was eating actual food, a sandwich Victor had told her was in the refrigerator, with a specificity that made it clear he'd put it there for her. She didn't pretend she hadn't been hungry. Cole came in and leaned against the doorframe. We have a problem, he said. She finished chewing. Wallace isn't going to stop, she said. That's what you're thinking. Even with the evidence, he said, even with Dempsey filing injunctions, Wallace still has money and he still has connections and he still has time. And Denise is good, but this process takes time and time costs money. I know, she said. The chapter doesn't have unlimited resources. We can fight this, but we can't fight it indefinitely. She set down the sandwich. So we need it to not take indefinitely. How? She looked at him. We need to change the public story before he does. Cole frowned slightly. What does that mean? Right now, she said, Wallace controls the narrative. He's got the complaints on record. He's got the inspection reports. He's got a story about a bar with regulatory problems that needs to be cleaned up for the good of the community. Nobody in this town is questioning that story because nobody in this town has a reason to. They don't know this bar. They know the rumor of it. So we change what they know, she said. The toy drive, Mrs. Paulson's porch, the medical bills, the things this chapter has done for this community for years that nobody sees because nobody was ever invited to see them. She leaned forward. Wallace is counting on this chapter being invisible, except for its reputation. He's counting on the town not caring enough to push back. If we change that, if the town sees what this place actually is before the hearing, then he doesn't just have a regulatory fight, he has a public opinion problem. Cole stared at her. She waited. You want us to go public, he said, not with resistance exactly, more like he was turning the idea over to look at all sides of it. I want you to let people see the truth. He said, there's a difference. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, most of these men have spent their whole lives not caring what this town thinks of them. I know, she said. I'm not asking them to care what the town thinks. I'm asking them to care about keeping this place open. Those are two different things. Cole looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something direct and almost unguarded, the face of a man who has had the same argument with himself for a long time and has just heard someone outside his own head articulate the side he couldn't quite reach. "I'll bring it to Victor," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. He turned to go. "Cole," she said. He stopped. She thought about what she wanted to say and chose the simple version because it was the true one. Whatever happened 6 years ago, whoever it was that did what they did, it wasn't nothing. I understand why it made you who you are. But you protected me on a shift when you didn't have to. You showed up every day when things got hard. You're the first person to say you were wrong when you were wrong." She paused. "That's not nothing either." He stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've been paying attention." "To everything," she said. He left. She picked up her sandwich and sat alone in the quiet back room of a bar that felt against every reasonable expectation like somewhere she belonged, and she thought about what was coming and let herself feel the full weight of it without flinching away from any part of it. The hearing was in 2 weeks. Wallace didn't know what was coming at him. The town didn't know yet what it was about to learn. And Emily Carter, who had walked through a door with $63 and no plan, except the plan to keep going, was right in the middle of something that was bigger than she'd understood when it started, and she was not going to let it be decided without her. The next morning, she found Cole in the bar before anyone else arrived. He was sitting at the counter with a mug of coffee and Victor's copy of the shoebox documentation laid out in front of him, going through it page by page with the focused attention of a man building something in his head. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He turned 3 pages toward her, the printed email chain between Wallace and Commissioner Hartley. "Read this," he said, specifically the third email. She read it. The third email was dated 7 months ago. In it, Wallace outlined the specific timeline for what he called the Route 9 consolidation, a project that, according to the email, had been in planning for over 2 years. It named 4 properties. The Black Viper was third on the list. 2 of the others had already been acquired. The fourth was a small auto repair shop 2 blocks down, owned by a man named Pete Garza, who had no idea he was on a list. She looked up. "He planned this years ago." "Read the last paragraph," Cole said. She read it. The last paragraph of the email was a single sentence. "Timeline accelerates if the community perception piece can be managed before Q3. She set the page down. "Community perception," she said. "He was always worried about it," Cole said, "even when he thought he had total control. He built in a risk assessment about what happens if people start paying attention." Emily looked at the page. Then she looked at Cole. "He's more afraid of the public story than the legal one." "Denise thought so too when I called her this morning," Cole said. "She said the legal case is solid but slow. The public case—" He paused. "She said if people start asking questions, Wallace's county allies get nervous. Nervous people stop returning phone calls." Emily pressed her hand flat on the page. "Then we don't wait for the hearing. We start the conversation now." "Victor's in," Cole said. He held her gaze. "I told him it was your idea." She hadn't expected that. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. And the way he said it was not about generosity. It was about accuracy, about a man who had spent 6 years being very specific about blame and was now being equally specific about credit. She thought about what it cost him to say it, and she didn't look away. "Okay," she said. "Then let's get to work." Cole nodded. He gathered the papers back into their order. And for the first time since Emily Carter had walked through the door of the Black Viper, Cole Bennett and Emily Carter were sitting on the same side of something. It had taken 39 days. Every one of them had mattered. What neither of them knew yet was that Richard Wallace had already discovered the shoebox was missing. Jimmy's silence had told him something had gone wrong, and that by morning Wallace was going to do something that changed the timeline for everyone. The careful, methodical campaign was over. What was coming next was not careful at all. Wallace moved first. He moved at 6:30 in the morning, which told Emily everything she needed to know about how rattled he was, because careful men with real power don't move at 6:30 in the morning. They move during business hours through proper channels with the full weight of institutional process behind them. They move in ways that are hard to argue with because they look legitimate. 6:30 in the morning was not a legitimate move. 6:30 in the morning was a man who had discovered his plan was coming apart and had decided that speed was the only thing he had left. Emily was in the back room when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Sandra, the waitress from the diner, and the text said, "There are county vehicles outside your bar. 3 of them. And someone I don't recognize in a suit talking to a police officer in the parking lot. She was dressed and through the storage room door in 45 seconds. Victor was already in the bar. He'd apparently never fully slept. She'd come to understand that about him, that in times of pressure, he operated on something other than normal rest running, on a kind of vigilant stillness that looked like calm, but was actually the opposite of rest. He was standing at the window with his phone to his ear, and he held up one finger when Emily came in, waited and kept listening to whoever was on the other end. Cole arrived 2 minutes later. He came through the back entrance, which meant he'd been close enough to get there that fast when something happened, which meant he'd also been not quite sleeping. He looked at Emily. "You heard." "Sandra texted me," she said. Victor ended his call. He turned from the window. "They're filing an emergency suspension order on the liquor license," he said. "Denise just called. It was submitted to the county clerk at 6 a.m. this morning. Someone expedited the processing." He paused. "Commissioner Hartley." The name landed in the room like a stone. Hartley. The man whose name was in the third email in Wallace's chain. The county official who appeared on the inspection paperwork. He had apparently looked at the situation. Maybe Wallace had called him. Maybe he'd made his own calculation and decided that moving aggressively before the shoebox became public record was worth the exposure. "If the suspension order goes through," Cole said, "we can't operate at all until the hearing." "When's the hearing?" Emily asked. 12 days, Victor said. 12 days of a closed bar, 12 days of no revenue, 12 days of whatever narrative Wallace and Hartley could construct in the absence of the Black Viper being able to speak for itself. Emily felt it in her chest, the specific pressure of a clock that has just started running faster than the plan accounted for. "Denise," she said. "I know," Victor said. He was already dialing. Denise Morales answered on the first ring. She had also apparently not been sleeping, or had been sleeping with one eye on her phone, which for a lawyer handling something like this was probably the same thing. Victor put her on speaker, and she laid it out with the clean efficiency of someone who had been mentally preparing for this exact move. "The emergency suspension is legally shaky," she said. "Emergency suspensions require evidence of immediate public safety risk. They don't have that. What they have is a filing discrepancy from 4 years ago and a set of anonymous complaints that I can now demonstrate were orchestrated. If I file a motion to stay the suspension this morning, I have a reasonable chance of blocking it before it takes effect." "How reasonable?" Cole asked. 60-40, she said, maybe 65-35. "But it requires me to file within the next 4 hours because the order processes at 11. "File it," Victor said. "I'm already typing," Denise said. "But Victor, this changes the hearing. If Hartley is actively involved in the suspension order, then what we're walking into in 12 days isn't just an administrative appeal, it's a corruption case. And that means I need everything in the shoebox formally authenticated before we walk through those doors. Timestamps verified. The email chain needs to be traceable to its source. The financial records need to be corroborated." "We'll have it," Emily said. A brief pause on the line. Denise had met Emily once. "You're the bartender," she said. "Yes," Emily said. "You're the one who figured out the community angle." "Yes." Another pause. Not skeptical processing. "Then here's what I need from that angle," Denise said. "I need people, not just the chapter. I need people from this town who can speak to what this bar has meant to them. Real people. Names, faces, stories. If this gets elevated to a public forum, and I believe it will, then the question won't just be about licensing compliance. It'll be about who Richard Wallace actually is and what this community actually wants. And that argument needs voices he can't dismiss." "How many?" Emily asked. "As many as you can get me in 12 days, Denise said. "But I'd rather have 5 people who speak from real experience than 30 who don't." The call ended. The 3 of them stood in the bar, and the morning was quiet outside, and the county vehicles were still in the lot, and Emily could feel the weight of the next 12 days pressing forward from the future. Victor looked at Cole. Cole looked at Emily. "Mrs. Paulson," Emily said. Cole blinked. "The woman whose porch the chapter rebuilt," Emily said. "Start there." Cole drove to Mrs. Paulson's house himself. He'd almost sent Ricky or Big Mike. because the instinct in him that didn't like asking for things, especially things that required explaining himself, ran deep. But Emily had said, start there, and he understood what she meant. If you're going to ask people to come forward, the person who asks has to be someone who means something to the asking. Ricky was likable. Big Mike was warm. Cole was the one who'd shown up in the rain 3 years ago with 4 other men and rebuilt an elderly woman's back porch in a single weekend because she'd mentioned at the gas station to no one in particular that her son kept saying he'd fix it and kept not coming. Mrs. Paulson was 81. She answered the door in a house robe and looked at Cole with the complete unsurprise of a woman who had lived long enough that almost nothing startled her anymore. I heard there was trouble, she said. Come in. He sat in her kitchen and she made coffee he didn't need, and he told her what was happening. All of it. Wallace, the inspections, the shoebox, the suspension order, the hearing. He told it straight without softening it because she was 81 years old and had no patience for being managed. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. That man wants to take the bar, she said. Yes, ma'am. And put what there instead? Condominiums, retail development, something that looks better on a county revitalization report. She made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated a complete opinion. My late husband used to say that the men who talk most about revitalizing a community are usually the ones most interested in replacing it. She looked at her coffee. What do you need from me? I need you to tell the truth, Cole said. At the hearing, about what the chapter has done for people in this town. About what the bar is. She looked at him with eyes that had been assessing people for 8 decades and knew the difference between what someone was saying and what they meant. You don't usually ask for things, she said. No, he said, I don't. Why now? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Emily sitting in the back room eating a sandwich, talking about what people do when they're cornered, and the way she'd said that's a human raid, like it was simple, like understanding people was just a matter of deciding to. Because someone reminded me that not asking doesn't mean it doesn't matter, he said. It just means people don't know it matters. Mrs. Paulson looked at him for a long moment. I'll be there, she said. Write down the date. Denise's motion to stay the suspension was granted at 10:47, 13 minutes before the order would have processed. Emily heard about it from Victor, who called her while she was standing outside Pete Garza's auto shop 2 blocks down Route 9, having walked there after Cole left for Mrs. Paulson's because she thought about the email that said Route 9 consolidation and the fact that Pete Garza's shop was 4th on the list and Pete Garza had no idea. She told him. He was a compact man in his early 50s with grease on his hands in the specific wariness of a small business owner who had learned that when someone came to you with unexpected news, the news was rarely good. She walked him through it, carefully Wallace the list. The timeline. She showed him the photocopies she'd made of the relevant section of the email. She watched his face go through several things in sequence, disbelief, then the specific recalibration that happens when something that seemed paranoid is suddenly revealed to be exactly accurate. Then anger, the clean kind that comes from feeling disrespected rather than afraid. He was going to come for my shop, Pete said. After the bar, Emily said. Yes. And nobody was going to tell me. Nobody knew except us. Now you know. Pete looked at the photocopy. What do you need? I need you at the hearing, she said, and I need you to tell anyone you trust about what's on that list. Pete looked up at her. You're the woman who took the job at this Viper. Yes, she said. I heard about you, he said. Sandra at the diner talks. Emily almost smiled. Sandra is a very good person. She is, Pete said. He folded the photocopy. I'll be there, and I'll bring my brother-in-law. He owns the tire place on 8th. Wallace probably has him on a list too. She went back to the Black Viper with 3 commitments, in a sense that something was beginning to turn slowly the way large things turn, not with a dramatic pivot, but with a series of small adjustments that don't look like much individually, and then one day you look up and the whole direction has changed. 7 days before the hearing, something happened that nobody planned for. It started with Sandra. Sandra had been at the diner for 19 years. She knew everyone in Silver Creek the way people who work in diners know towns not through power or position, but through the accumulated intimacy of 10,000 small conversations of remembering how people take their coffee and what they say when things are hard, and who they ask about when they ask about other people. Sandra posted something on the local community Facebook page. It wasn't long, it was 3 paragraphs. She talked about the toy drive she'd seen every November for years, the boxes left anonymously at the community center, with a note that just said from your neighbors. She talked about Mrs. Paulson's porch. She talked about a family, she didn't name them, whose father had been in the hospital for 6 weeks 3 years ago, and whose medical bills had been quietly handled by people who never expected to be thanked. She ended with, I don't know everything about the Black Viper or the men who run it, but I know what I've seen. And what I've seen deserves to be part of this conversation. By midnight, it had been shared 47 times. By the following morning, it was at 212. Emily found out about it when Victor handed her his phone across the bar at 7 a.m. without a word. Bam. She read it. She handed the phone back. She didn't tell us she was going to do that, Emily said. No, Victor said. He looked at the phone. Something in his face was doing something she'd never seen it do before, not quite emotion, not exactly, more like the face of a man who has spent years believing that what he did quietly was enough and has just discovered that someone else thought it was worth saying out loud. He set the phone down. I should call her, he said. You should, Emily said. He didn't move for a moment. I don't know what to say. Tell her thank you, Emily said. That's the whole thing. You don't need more than that. He picked up his phone. She went back to the bar. An hour later, Cole came in with a piece of paper printed from the library, because that was apparently becoming the chapter's preferred method of delivering important documents. He set it on the bar in front of Emily. It was a comment thread under Sandra's post. There were 64 comments. Most of them were from people in Silver Creek who had their own version of Sandra's story. Small things, most of them specific things. Things that had the texture of actual memory rather than general sentiment. A woman whose car had been jump-started in winter by 2 men from the chapter who had appeared seemingly from nowhere and disappeared the same way. A man who described a situation 5 years ago he wasn't specific about, but said the chapter had intervened in a way that mattered. And then one comment buried in the middle of the thread from an account name Emily didn't recognize that said simply, Richard Wallace has done this before. Ask about the Meridian Street property in Reno. Ask about what happened to the Garcias. Emily read it twice. She looked at Cole. Do you know that name? She said. The Garcias. No, he said. He was already pulling out his phone. She was already reaching for hers. The Garcias were a family in Reno who had owned a restaurant supply business on Meridian Street for 22 years. 5 years ago, they had been the subject of a sustained regulatory campaign that had lasted 14 months and ended with them selling their property at 30% below market value to a development group that listed buried in its corporate filings a consulting firm owned by Richard Wallace. The father, Ernesto Garcia, was 73 years old and had retired to a house 40 minutes outside Silver Creek. Cole drove. Emily sat in the passenger seat of his truck, the first time she'd been in his truck, the first time they had gone anywhere together outside of the bar, and neither of them said anything about that because there wasn't anything to say. They were going somewhere that mattered. Everything else could wait. Ernesto Garcia opened his door and looked at them both and said, I wondered when someone would come. He said it not with bitterness, but with the particular patience of a man who has been waiting for something he knew was eventually coming and has made his peace with the waiting without ever making peace with what caused it. He brought them inside. He made coffee. He talked for 90 minutes. He told them about the first inspection, which had come 6 weeks after a man in a pressed shirt had offered to buy his business and been politely refused. He told them about the second and the third. He told them about the anonymous complaints, one of which had alleged that his restaurant supply business was operating as an unlicensed food service establishment, a complaint so nonsensical it should have been dismissed immediately and instead had triggered a 30-day review process that cost him $11,000 in legal fees to resolve. He told them about Commissioner Hartley, who had been the county official managing the inspection process in Reno at that time, before he had apparently moved his operation to Silver Creek. He told them about the day he sold. He didn't look at either of them when he told them that part. He looked at the table. I had enough to fight, he said, but not enough to keep fighting. That's the thing people don't understand about how Wallace works. He doesn't beat you. He just makes sure that keeping your business costs more than you have for longer than you can hold out. And eventually, he stopped. He looked at his hands. Eventually, you signed the paper. Emily was very still. She was thinking about $63, about 14 months of fighting that nobody had helped with because nobody had known, about the way Wallace's system was designed to work on people one at a time in isolation, where the pattern was invisible because each person only saw their own piece of it. Would you testify? She asked. Ernesto looked at her. He looked at Cole. Is it going to matter? He asked. Yes, Emily said. She said it without hesitation, without the hedging of someone who isn't sure. She said it because she believed it and because she knew that Ernesto Garcia had waited 5 years for someone to come and ask him this question. And the only thing that was going to make the asking mean anything was the certainty behind it. He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said, I'll testify. Cole drove back to Silver Creek in the late afternoon. The desert was doing the thing it did at that hour where the light went sideways, and everything that had looked plain and flat during the day suddenly had texture and depth and shadow. Emily watched it through the window. He waited 5 years, she said. I know, Cole said. 5 years and nobody came. Until you found the comment in a Facebook thread, Cole said. She shook her head. Sandra wrote the post. The person who commented about the Garcias found us. We just showed up when we were supposed to. Cole was quiet for a moment. You think there's more like him? Other people Wallace has done this to. I think Denise is going to find them faster than we can, Emily said. Now that she has the pattern and the name and a corroborated case history, she paused. But I also think it's possible we've already got enough. Cole drove. The silence was comfortable in a way it had never been before. Not the loaded silence of two people managing their distance from each other, but the easy silence of people who are thinking about the same thing and don't need to narrate it. I owe you an apology, Cole said. She didn't say no, you don't. She didn't do him the disservice of brushing it off. She said, okay. I made up my mind about you before you'd done anything, he said. I looked for proof that I was right instead of looking at what was actually in front of me. You had reasons, she said. I had reasons, he agreed. That doesn't make what I did fair. She looked at the road. No, she said. It doesn't, but I understood it. And you changed when the evidence changed. She paused. Not everybody does that. Some people just find new reasons. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then quietly, what you said about people doing things because they're cornered, about Jimmy. Yes, I've been thinking about it since you said it. He kept his eyes on the road. The person who betrayed the chapter 6 years ago. The reason I've been the way I've been with new people since then. A pause. I never thought about it the way you said it. I only ever thought about what he did, not why. Emily said nothing. She let it sit. It doesn't change it, Cole said. What he did. No, she said. It doesn't change it, but understanding it changes you. And changing you is the part you actually have control over. He didn't answer, but something in him was different by the time they pulled back into the Black Viper lot. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time had been not released but acknowledged. And sometimes acknowledgement is the thing that has to happen first. So 3 days before the hearing, Denise called with news that changed the shape of everything. She had found 2 more cases, one in Fallon, one in Elko. Both had the same pattern of business that refused to sell an anonymous complaint campaign, a county official connected to Wallace on the inspection paperwork. In the Fallon case, the business owner had kept records not as comprehensive as Jimmy's shoebox, but enough to corroborate the methodology. We now have 3 corroborated cases across 3 counties, Denise said. Hartley appears in 2 of them. A different county official appears in the 3rd, but the consulting firm connection to Wallace is the same. She paused. I've made a call to the state AG's office. The room went very still. Victor said, you're taking this to the state. I'm telling the state what we have, Denise said. They can decide what they want to do with it. But I'll tell you what I told them. We're walking into a hearing in 72 hours, and we intend to present this evidence in a public forum, and whatever attention that generates is going to generate it whether the AG has had time to prepare or not. Another pause. The AA's office said they want a briefing call tomorrow morning. After the call ended, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Big Mike, who had been sitting at the bar during the call, and whom Emily sometimes forgot was there because he was so quiet when he was listening, set down his coffee mug very carefully and said, is this the part where I should be scared or the part where I should be relieved? Both, Emily said. Those two things aren't exclusive. Big Mike nodded slowly like that was the most accurate thing he'd heard all week. Victor looked at Emily, not asking anything, just looking. The way he sometimes did, the way she'd come to understand was his version of acknowledgement of registering something without making it into a speech. She looked back. She thought about the day she'd walked into this bar with a resume and $63 and the absolute conviction that she had nothing left to lose. She thought about how wrong she'd been, not about the need, but about the nothing. She had not had nothing. She'd had the ability to show up and stay and pay attention and not run when it got complicated. That wasn't nothing. That had turned out to be exactly what was needed. The hearing was in 3 days. Wallace didn't know about Ernesto Garcia. He didn't know about Fallon or Elko or the AG's briefing call. He didn't know about Sandra's Facebook post or Mrs. Paulson or Pete Garza and his brother-in-law and the growing number of people in Silver Creek who had read a comment thread and realized that what was happening to the Black Viper was not a regulatory matter. It was a pattern, and patterns once visible were very hard to make invisible again. He thought he was walking into an administrative hearing. He was walking into something he had never prepared for. Because the one thing Richard Wallace had never accounted for in all his careful planning, all his lists and timelines and managed perception strategies, was a 25-year-old woman with $63 who had walked through a door he'd assumed would stay empty and had spent 46 days building exactly the thing he'd spent years making sure these people would never have. A community that would stand up for them. Emily sat in the back room that night and couldn't sleep. She lay on the fold-out couch and stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet of the bar settling around her and let herself feel everything she'd been too busy to feel for the past 6 weeks. She let herself feel how scared she'd been when she walked through that door the first time. She let herself feel what it had meant when Victor said the couch was hers. She let herself feel the exact moment when Cole had said, "I was wrong," without ceremony or excuse, just plain, and how much it had cost him and how much that cost had mattered. She thought about her mother and what her mother would say right now. She thought her mother would say, "You did what you had to do. Now do what comes next." What came next was the hearing, and she was ready. The morning of the hearing, Emily woke up at 4:30 and didn't try to go back to sleep. She lay on the fold-out couch in the dark and listened to the bar around her. The specific silence of a building that has held a lot of living inside it, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but compressed. Like the walls have absorbed every conversation and every argument and every laugh and every hard night and are holding all of it in reserve. She'd been sleeping in this room for over a month now. She knew it sounds the way you only know a place when you've been still inside it long enough that it stops performing and just is. She got up. She went to the bar. She made coffee in the dark because she knew where everything was without the lights, and she sat on a stool at the counter and held the mug with both hands and let herself be very quiet inside, while the world outside was also quiet because she understood that the next several hours were going to require everything she had, and she needed to spend this last piece of stillness carefully. She thought about Denise's briefing call with the AG's office. She thought about Ernesto Garcia, who had driven in last night and was staying at the motel on Route 12, and who had called her at 9 p.m. just to confirm the time, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of a man who had made a decision and was not going back on it. She thought about Mrs. Paulson, who had called Victor 2 days ago to say she'd arranged a ride and she'd be there at 9 and to please tell that young woman she was proud of her. And Victor had relayed this to Emily with the expression of someone delivering a message they weren't entirely sure how to carry, but were glad to deliver. She thought about Jimmy. Jimmy Reyes was not going to the hearing. That had been a conversation, a real one, painful, the kind that nobody walked away from feeling entirely clean, and the conclusion they'd landed on was that Jimmy's presence would complicate things in ways that helped Wallace more than it helped the chapter. What Jimmy had done, the records he'd kept, the information he'd finally surrendered, would be present in the room through the documents, through Denise's argument, through the chain of evidence that connected Wallace's scheme from beginning to end. Jimmy himself would carry what he'd done in a different way, in a different room, at a different time. Emily had talked to him once 3 days ago. She'd gone to his house. She hadn't told anyone she was going. She'd just gone and he'd opened the door, looking like a man who had been awake for a week and expected to be for another week after that. She'd stood on his front step and said, "You came forward before you had to. That matters." He looked at her with red eyes and said, "I should have come forward 8 months ago." "Yes," she said, "but you didn't have what you needed 8 months ago. You needed to believe there was somewhere to land." He'd stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I don't know if Victor will ever," he started. "I don't know either," she said. "But I know that what you gave us is the reason we have a chance tomorrow. Hold on to that. The rest is going to take time." She'd driven back to the bar. She hadn't told anyone about the visit. Some things didn't need to be announced. She sat with her coffee now and thought about all of it, and then she set the mug down and thought, enough. You've thought it through enough. Now you just have to go do it. The bar started filling up at 6:30, not with customers, with men. The chapter arriving in ones and twos, all of them earlier than they needed to be, all of them with the specific alert energy of people who have been preparing for something and are now at the point where preparation ends and doing begins. Big Mike came in first suit jacket over his leather vest in a combination that should have been incongruous and somehow wasn't. Ricky, who had been vibrating with contained intensity for 3 days, was already making jokes that were slightly too fast and slightly too loud, which was how Emily had learned he managed nerves. Others she'd come to know over 6 weeks, faces that had been foreign to her once and were now as readable as her own. Cole arrived at 7. He was wearing a jacket she hadn't seen before, dark, clean, the kind of jacket that was the closest thing to formal wear for a man who didn't own formal wear and was doing his best. He looked at her and she looked at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words, the kind of communication that develops between people who have spent weeks paying close attention to each other. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Ask me in 6 hours," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. The situation was too weighted for a full smile, but the near miss of one which on Cole was more meaningful than a full smile would have been on someone else. Victor came out of the back in the dark jacket he apparently kept for days that required one. He looked at the room, at all of them, all his people gathered in this space that they had been fighting for, and he didn't give a speech. Victor Hayes was not a man who gave speeches. He picked up his coffee, looked at his watch, and said, "We leave in 20 minutes. Denise is meeting us there." That was all. 20 minutes later, they walked out of the Black Viper together. The county hearing room was a space that had not been designed for the number of people who showed up. Emily understood this the moment they walked through the door. The room held perhaps 80 seats, and it was already 3/4 full an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin with people she recognized and people she didn't. Sandra was there in the second row with 2 women Emily had seen at the diner but never spoken to. Pete Garza was there with his brother-in-law, who turned out to be a broad man named Carlos with a firm handshake and the expression of someone who had arrived prepared to be angry on behalf of people he'd decided deserved it. Mrs. Paulson was in the front row, which she had apparently claimed early because she was 81 years old and had no patience for bad sight lines. Ernesto Garcia was in the third row. He nodded at Emily when she came in. She nodded back. There were others she didn't know. People who had read Sandra's post, people who had read the comments, people who had their own small reasons for being there that she would never know, fully connected by the specific social fabric of a small town that had been quietly watching something happen and had finally decided to show up and watch it in person. Richard Wallace arrived at 8:55. He came with 2 men in suits, lawyers, clearly expensive ones with the posture of people who are accustomed to winning administrative hearings, and he walked in with the confidence of a man who has run this play before and knows how it ends. He looked at the room and the confidence held because from the outside you could look at a full hearing room and read it as irrelevant or even advantageous. A crowd was not evidence, and Wallace dealt in evidence, or rather in the absence of evidence against him. He sat down. He didn't look at Victor. He didn't look at Emily either. She was just a bartender. She wasn't part of his calculation. That was the mistake that had always been his mistake, and he still hadn't corrected it. Denise Morales arrived at 8:58 and sat her leather bag on the table with the practiced economy of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She looked at Emily once and gave a small nod that communicated we're ready. Stay steady. The hearing officer, a woman in her late 50s named Judge Patricia Okafor, whose jurisdiction covered administrative appeals of this type, called the room to order at 9 o'clock exactly. Judge Okafor had the particular authority of someone who had not acquired it through performance, but through 2 decades of being in rooms exactly like this one and understanding better than anyone else present how they actually worked. She looked at the filing, looked at both tables, and said, "We are here on the matter of the emergency suspension order and associated licensing action against the Black Viper Route 9 Silver Creek. I've reviewed the submitted materials. I'm going to hear from both sides, and I'm going to hear from any witnesses called. Let's begin." Wallace's lawyers went first. They were good. Emily had expected them to be good, and they were organized, precise, presenting the paper trail of complaints and inspection reports and the filing discrepancy with the clean confidence of people who had assembled the same argument in 6 other jurisdictions and had rarely lost. They talked about regulatory compliance and public safety standards and the county's responsibility to ensure that establishments operating on liquor licenses met their obligations without exception. They were careful not to make it personal. They never mentioned Wallace by name in relation to anything framing the action as purely administrative. When they finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when an argument has been made competently. Denise stood up. She said, "Your Honor, the respondent will demonstrate that the regulatory actions brought against the Black Viper are not, in fact, administrative in nature. They are the latest iteration of a coordinated scheme orchestrated by a private developer, Richard Wallace, in partnership with a county official, Commissioner Daniel Hartley, for the purpose of forcing the sale of a property Wallace has sought to acquire for over 2 years. We have documentation. We have corroborating cases from 2 other counties. And we have a witness whose account connects this scheme directly to events in this community." Wallace's lead attorney was on his feet. "Objection, these are serious allegations without the documentation will be entered into the record," Denise said, completely even. "Every allegation has a corresponding exhibit." She looked at Judge Okafor. "May I proceed?" Judge Okafor looked at Wallace's table. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. "Just sit down. You'll have the opportunity to respond. Right now I'm listening." Denise proceeded. She walked through the email chain, first the one between Wallace and Commissioner Hartley, the one with the Route 9 consolidation timeline, the one with the paragraph about community perception. She entered it as Exhibit A. She walked through the financial records from Jimmy's shoebox, the payments, the dates, the correlation with specific inspection visits. Exhibit B. She presented the Reno case, the Garcia's 22 years on Meridian Street, the inspection campaign, the property sale, the corporate filing connecting the buyer to Wallace's consulting firm. Exhibit C. She presented the Fallon case shorter but structurally identical. Exhibit D. With each exhibit, the room's silence changed quality. It wasn't the silence of people waiting for something to happen. It was the silence of people watching something happen and understanding that what they were watching was significant. Wallace was very still at his table. His lawyers were writing things on their legal pads with increasing speed. "I'd like to call my first witness," Denise said. She called Ernesto Garcia. He walked to the front of the room with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has waited 5 years for this walk and is not going to rush it. He was sworn in. He sat down. And he told his story with the plainness of someone who has told it to himself so many times in the privacy of his own reckoning that the facts are just facts now, not raw, not performed, just completely irreducibly true. He described the first man in the pressed shirt who came to buy his business. He described the first inspection. He described 14 months of a campaign that his family had spent every resource they had to fight and had ultimately lost. He identified Commissioner Hartley from the paperwork by name. He said quietly, "I signed that paper on a Tuesday morning. I drove home and I sat in my car and I didn't go inside for an hour because I didn't know how to tell my wife." The room was very still. Wallace's lead attorney stood for cross-examination. He tried 3 angles. He questioned Ernesto's memory of specific dates. He questioned whether the inspection process could have been coincidental. He questioned whether the Reno and Silver Creek cases were actually connected or merely similar. Ernesto answered each question with the same quiet, specific accuracy. He didn't get flustered. He didn't elaborate beyond the question. He just answered, and every answer was exact, and exactness was a thing the other side could not afford. The attorney sat back down. Denise called Mrs. Paulson. Mrs. Paulson walked to the front of the room with her cane and her house dress and the complete unself-consciousness of a woman who had stopped caring about performing anything for anyone approximately 30 years ago. She was sworn in. She sat down. Judge Okafor looked at her with the specific warmth that some judges develop for elderly witnesses, which is less condescension than genuine respect. Ma'am, please take your time. Mrs. Paulson said, I don't need much time, Your Honor. I have 3 things to say. She looked at the judge. Those men rebuilt my porch in a single weekend and would not take a dime for it. I have lived in Silver Creek for 53 years, and I have watched them do things like that for people in this town repeatedly, and without expectation of anything in return. And whatever this man, she did not look at Wallace, but the room understood who she meant. Whatever this man has filed on paper, it is not the truth of what that bar is. And I am 81 years old, and I have watched enough people try to paper over the truth to know that eventually the paper runs out. She stood up before Denise could ask another question, which she'd apparently decided she was done, and walked back to her seat. There was a sound in the room that wasn't quite applause. It was softer than that, less organized, the sound of a room full of people who have just heard something they believe said out loud. Judge Okafor's expression did not change, but her eyes did. Then Denise said, Your Honor, I'd like to call Emily Carter. Emily had known this was coming. Denise had told her 2 days ago, walked her through what she'd be asked, prepared her the way a good lawyer prepares a witness, not by telling her what to say, but by helping her understand what the moment needed and trusting her to find her own way to it. She walked to the front of the room. She was aware of the chapter behind her, Victor Cole, Big Mike Rickey, all of them, the weight of their presence at her back like something solid. She was aware of Sandra in the second row, and Pete Garza and Carlos and Ernesto Garcia and Mrs. Paulson in the front row, who gave her one sharp nod that said everything it needed to say. She sat down. She was sworn in. Denise said, Miss Carter, can you tell us why you went to work at the Black Viper? Emily looked at the room. Not at Wallace, not at the judge specifically. At the room, at all of it, all the people who had come here for different reasons and were sitting together in the same space. I had $63, she said. I've been applying for work in Silver Creek for 2 weeks and nobody would hire me. The Black Viper had a sign in the window and I needed it all. I went in, and what did you find? I found a bar full of men with a reputation the town had built, mostly from fear and mostly from a distance, she said. And then over 6 weeks that I found out what they actually were, Sarah. I found out about the toy drive. I found out about Mrs. Paulson's porch. I found out about families whose medical bills were paid by men who never signed their names to it. I found out that the reason this chapter has a fearsome reputation is partly because nobody ever came close enough to learn anything different. And when you discovered what Richard Wallace was doing, I found the pattern in public records, Emily said, the same way anyone could have, because Wallace was counting on nobody looking. He was counting on a community that had already written these men off, that had decided they were dangerous and stopped asking questions about them to stay on the other side of that assumption while he took what he wanted. She paused. He miscalculated. How? He didn't account for someone who had nothing left to lose going in there and discovering people worth fighting for. She looked at the judge. Your Honor, I've read the inspection reports. I've read the complaints. I know that on paper this looks like a legitimate regulatory action, but I also know what I found in the library that first morning and what was in that shoebox and what Ernesto Garcia's face looked like when he talked about sitting in his car for an hour before he could go inside and tell his wife. This isn't about compliance. It's about a man who uses compliance as a weapon and counts on people being too isolated and too broke to fight back long enough for the truth to come out. She stopped. The room was completely quiet. Wallace's attorney stood for cross-examination. He asked her 3 questions about her qualifications, her tenure at the bar, the basis for her characterization of the inspection process as coordinated. She answered each one with the same directness she'd brought to everything for 6 weeks. On the 3rd question, she said, I'm a bartender. I don't have credentials. What I have is a shoebox full of documents in 3 corroborated cases from 3 counties and a room full of people who came here because the truth is specific and specific things are hard to dismiss. The attorney sat down without asking a 4th question. Denise said, no further witnesses, Your Honor. Judge Okafor called a 20-minute recess. During those 20 minutes, Wallace spoke to his attorneys in the kind of urgent, controlled murmur that communicates panic while trying not to perform it. Emily watched from across the room. Without watching directly, she'd learned this skill behind a bar, the ability to see everything in your peripheral field while appearing to look at something else. Cole appeared next to her. "You did well," he said. "I said what was true," she said. "That's what doing well looks like," he said. Big Mike materialized on her other side with a cup of water that she hadn't asked for and accepted gratefully. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, large and steady, the way he always was, and the warmth of it was real and simple, and she thought, this is what people don't see from the outside. This is the thing that looked like a threat and was actually this. The recess ended. Judge Okafor returned. She did not immediately rule. She said she was going to address several things in sequence, which was judicial language for "I have a lot to say, and I want to say it correctly." She addressed the emergency suspension order first. She said that an emergency suspension requires clear and present evidence of public safety risk, and that no such evidence had been demonstrated, and that accordingly the suspension order was invalid and was immediately rescinded. One of Wallace's attorneys wrote something on his pad. Then Judge Okafor said something that no one had quite prepared for. She said, "I want to address the evidentiary record before me regarding the broader pattern of conduct attributed to Mr. Wallace and Commissioner Hartley. In 30 years of administrative law, I have occasionally encountered situations where the matter before me is larger than the specific case filed. This is one of those situations." She looked at the room. The documentation presented today corroborated across 3 cases, 3 counties, involving the same methodology and some of the same actors describes conduct that exceeds the scope of what I can adjudicate in this forum. I am therefore making a formal referral of this matter to the State Attorney General's office for full investigation. She paused. I understand that office has already been in contact with counsel for the respondent. I expect this referral will not come as a surprise. Dead silence. Then the licensing action against the Black Viper is dismissed. The establishment's license remains in full effect. This matter is closed. She gathered her papers. She stood. And the room, which had been holding its breath for 90 minutes, let it go all at once. It didn't happen the way it happens in movies. There was no single explosive moment. No one cheered. No one broke into applause. No one did anything dramatic. What happened was quieter and more real than that. People turned to each other. Sandra reached over and grabbed the hand of the woman next to her. Pete Garza looked at his brother-in-law and said something Emily couldn't hear. Ernesto Garcia sat very still for a moment with his eyes closed. And the expression on his face was not triumph. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for 5 years and has just finally been allowed to set it down. Wallace left the room quickly. His attorneys followed. They walked past the Black Viper's table without looking at it, which was its own kind of commentary. Commissioner Hartley, who had been present in the back of the room as an observer, apparently operating on the assumption that this was going to be a swift administrative win, was the last to leave. He paused at the door. He looked at Victor Hayes with the expression of a man who has just understood that the calculation he'd been running for 2 years was wrong from the first number. Victor looked back at him. That was all, just looked. The way Victor looked at things completely without flinching, with the patience of a man who could afford to wait. Hartley left. Victor turned back to the room. He looked at Denise, who was organizing her papers with the composed satisfaction of someone who does excellent work and knows it and doesn't need to make a speech about it. He said, "Thank you, Denise." She said, "Buy me dinner sometime." He almost smiled. Done. Then he looked at Emily. She was standing near the wall, slightly separate from the group, not because she felt outside it, but because she needed a moment. Just one moment, to let it land. Victor walked over to her. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood next to her and looked at the room at Mrs. Paulson accepting someone's help with her coat at Ricky, trying to explain something to Carlos with enormous hand gestures at Big Mike, who was standing with Ernesto Garcia and appeared to be exchanging phone numbers. Then he said, "When you walked in 6 weeks ago, I gave you the job because you answered the question correctly." "I remember," she said. "I didn't give it to you because I thought you'd do this," he said. "I didn't know you were going to do this." "Nobody did." "I didn't know either," she said. I was trying not to get fired." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd ever heard from him. Low, short, real. "You're not getting fired," he said. "Good," she said. Cole found her outside. She'd stepped out to breathe. The room had filled up with the specific warm noise of aftermath, people talking too fast and laughing too easily, the way they do when tension breaks. And she was standing in the parking lot in the morning air and thinking about nothing in particular, just breathing, when she heard his boots on the pavement. He came and stood next to her. They stood there for a moment. "There's something I never asked you," he said. "Okay," she said. "The morning after the chapter meeting, after Victor offered you the storage room." He looked at the sky. "You were already awake when I got there. You'd been there all night. I could tell. But you didn't say anything about it, you just started working." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you say anything about how hard things had been, about what you were going through? You could have said it sooner." She thought about that. "Because I didn't come here for sympathy," she said. "I came here for a job, and I needed you to see what I could do before you knew what I didn't have. Because if you knew I was sleeping in my car first, you'd never see past it. You'd either feel sorry for me or suspicious of me, and either one would have gotten in the way of what I actually needed to show you." Cole looked at her. Something moved across his face, something that was understanding and recognition, and something more personal than either of those things. "You're the most self-contained person I've ever met," he said. "I was raised to be," she said. "My mom didn't have much. She said needing things was fine, but making people witness your need was a currency you spent carefully." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Cole said. "She was," Emily said. "She died 2 years ago. She said it simply the way she learned to say it, not to close the conversation, but because it was true, and the truth didn't need packaging." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way he said everything, directly without embellishment, meaning exactly what he said. "Thank you," she said, meaning it exactly. They stood in the quiet for a little while. Then Cole said, "For what it's worth, I see you, not past anything, not around anything." He paused. "Just you, what you actually are." She looked at him. She held his gaze and held the moment and didn't deflect it or diminish it or make a joke about it the way she might have made a joke about it 6 weeks ago when she was still building walls instead of living in a place where the walls had already been built and she'd been slowly, carefully invited inside them. "That's worth a lot," she said. He nodded. He looked like he might say something else. Then he just nodded again once, and she understood that for Cole Bennett, this was its own kind of completeness. They went back inside. Ushin. 3 months later, the Black Viper was different and the same. The same in the ways that mattered. The bar ran the same. Victor was the same. The men were the same. The code was the same. The jukebox had its same unwritten sequence. Big Mike still brought food with no ceremony. Ricky was still the loudest person in any room he occupied. The fold-out couch in the storage room was still Emily's, though she'd started looking at a studio apartment 2 streets over because she had the deposit now, and it was time. Different in the ways that had grown from what happened. The photographs were Ricky's idea. He'd gone through years of photos, the toy drives, the community events, the small, unglamorous moments of people helping other people, and put them up along the wall behind the bar. Not as a statement, he said, just because they were there. Just because they were true. Sandra brought her book club on the first Thursday of every month now. It had started as a gesture of solidarity, a show of community support in the weeks after the hearing, and then they discovered they liked it. Liked the bar, liked the particular straightforward warmth of the place, and had stayed because they wanted to. Pete Garza came in on Friday nights. His brother-in-law Carlos came on Saturdays. They'd both been contacted by the AG's investigator, had given statements, had become part of something larger than they'd anticipated when they walked into a hearing room on a Tuesday morning. Ernesto Garcia had driven back to Silver Creek twice since the hearing. The second time he'd stayed for dinner, and he and Victor had talked for 3 hours at the corner table about nothing in particular about their kids, about Nevada, about the way small towns changed and didn't change. And Emily had watched from behind the bar and thought this is what was lost when he had to sell. Not just a building, this. Richard Wallace was under active investigation by the state AG's office. Commissioner Hartley had resigned 12 days after the hearing. The Route 9 consolidation project had been formally suspended, pending the investigation's outcome. Wallace's lawyers had issued a statement that said nothing while appearing to say something, which was what lawyers did when their client was managing a situation rather than resolving it, and managing took a long time. Jimmy Reyes had not come back to the bar. Victor had called him once 3 weeks after the hearing, a call that Emily didn't know the content of and didn't ask about. What she knew was that Victor had made the call, which was its own kind of answer about what kind of man Victor Hayes was. The rest of it was between the two of them, and it would find its shape or it wouldn't, and either way, it was real. On a Tuesday evening in late October, the bar quiet, the weeknight crowd thin and comfortable, the kind of shift that moves at its own pace. Cole set a coffee down next to Emily at the end of the bar. She looked at it. "You keep doing this," she said. "You keep forgetting to make it," he said. She picked it up. "I'm leaving the storage room," she said. "I have found a place." "I know," he said. "Victor told me. 2 streets over." "I should have done it sooner," she said. "You did it when you had what you needed to do it," he said. "That's not the same as late." She held the mug and looked at the bar, at the photographs on the wall, at the familiar faces scattered across the room, at the space that had looked so foreign the first time she walked into it, and now looked like the place that had been there the whole time she was looking for something to hold on to. She said, "I came in here to ask for a job." "I know," Cole said. "I had no idea what I was walking into." "Neither did we," he said. She looked at him. "You thought I was going to be trouble." "You were trouble," he said, "just not the kind I expected." She almost laughed. Not quite. The moment was too layered for a full laugh, too dense with everything that had happened and everything that was still happening and everything that was just beginning to become clear. But close. Victor appeared from the back and looked at the two of them and said nothing, which was another thing about Victor. He knew when a moment needed room, and he gave it room without making a production of the giving. He went to check on something at the other end of the bar. Emily sat with her coffee and the quiet Tuesday and the photographs and the people and thought about her mother the way she thought about her mother every few days now, and what her mother would see if she could see this. She thought her mother would see a woman who had walked into the hardest possible version of a situation and had stayed and had paid attention and had refused to let fear make her decisions for her. She thought her mother would see that the people who had looked most dangerous from the outside had been the ones who made room when nobody else would. She thought her mother would see what happened when a community, even a fractured one, even one divided by rumor and reputation, in years of not looking clearly, was given one specific, undeniable human reason to look again. She thought her mother would say, "You did what you had to do, and then you did what came next, and look." Emily Carter had walked into the Black Viper with $63 and the stubborn conviction that the only direction available was forward. She had found inside what everyone told her was the most dangerous room in Silver Creek, the most honest people she'd ever known. She had stayed when leaving would have been easier, fought when walking away would have been safer, and told the truth in a room full of people who needed to hear it even when the truth was hard and the room was complicated and the outcome was uncertain. She had changed the story this town told about the men behind that door. She had changed what those men believed about who would stand beside them. She had changed something in Cole Bennett that 6 years of guardedness had calcified, and she had done it not through persuasion or strategy, but through the oldest, most stubborn method available, by being exactly and completely herself every day until there was no reasonable argument left against her. And in doing all of that without planning any of it, she had built something in Silver Creek that had not existed before she arrived, a community that had looked past its own fear and found that what was on the other side was worth knowing. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place where they belong without understanding that belonging isn't found. It's built one honest day at a time in the specific and unrepeatable space between who you are and who the people around you are, in the daily decision to show up and stay and do the work and tell the truth. Emily Carter had built that. She had built it in a biker bar in the Nevada desert with $63 and nothing to lose, and she had built it to last.